By then, his quiet had stopped feeling empty and started feeling intentional. It wasn't withdrawal, it was curation. He chose what to let into his life with the same care other people use to choose furniture. Nothing excessive, nothing temporary, nothing that couldn't justify its place. I began to notice how others failed to notice him, how conversations bent around louder neighbors, how his absence from gatherings was explained away as disinterest, or worse, arrogance. People prefer reasons that don't require curiosity. It's easier to dismiss what you don't understand than to admit you didn't try. He moved through shared spaces like someone who knew exactly how much noise his footsteps made. The mailbox, the sidewalk, the narrow gap between our houses. He never startled anyone, never announced himself, but if you paid attention, he was always aware of who was nearby, of when to step aside, of when to hold a door a second longer than necessary. I admired that restraint more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't attraction in the way people usually mean it. There was no fantasy version of him in my head, no imagined confessions or stolen moments. What drew me in was dignity, the way he never used silence as a weapon, the way he didn't perform pain or demand understanding. He carried whatever burden he had privately, and somehow that made the rest of us look careless by comparison. He avoided the jokes that turned people into targets. When conversations veered toward gossip, he found a reason to leave. When someone tried to pull him into speculation about another neighbor, another rumor, he deflected without defending. Neutrality wasn't cowardice for him. It was principle. Once, at a neighborhood meeting I only attended out of obligation, someone complained about odd behavior on the block. Too much quiet, too much privacy. Eyes flicked toward him without naming him. He didn't react, didn't stiffen, didn't justify himself. He simply listened, like someone accustomed to being misunderstood and unwilling to correct it unless it mattered. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. He noticed me too, not in the way that flatters, not with curiosity that asks for permission, but with awareness that suggested he had been tracking patterns long before I became conscious of mine. When I hesitated at the edge of conversations, he shifted his stance to make room. When my voice dropped, his attention sharpened. When I left early, he noted the timing without comment. There was an intelligence to his attention that made my own feel clumsy. I observed from a distance. He responded from proximity. I watched because I was afraid to engage. He noticed because he was already engaged with the world, even if quietly. Once, as we crossed paths near the fence line, our eyes met and held. Not long, not intimate, but deliberate. No smile, no greeting, just recognition. In that second, something unspoken passed between us. Not comfort, not warning, confirmation. He knew I was paying attention, and he let it continue. I told myself that meant nothing, that mutual awareness didn't imply permission, that silence wasn't an invitation, but something shifted after that moment. The air between our houses felt thinner, charged, like a question waiting too long to be asked. I had thought I was invisible to him because he never reached out. What I didn't understand yet was that he had already seen me and chosen to wait. It happened on a night that felt no different from the others, which is why it took me so long to recognize it as the moment everything tilted. I was coming home later than usual, head full, body on autopilot, when I noticed his back door still open. Not wide, just enough. A slice of warm light against the dark. I slowed without meaning to. Told myself it was concern, a safety instinct. Anyone would notice an open door that late. Anyone would wonder. I didn't step onto his property. I stayed where I belonged. That's the lie I kept returning to. That distance alone was morality. From where I stood, I could see his kitchen. Clean, sparse, a life arranged for function, not comfort. On the counter sat his phone, screen lit, untouched. A video paused mid-motion. Two figures frozen in laughter, shoulders close, a moment caught without spectacle. Not explicit, not hidden, just intimate in a way that felt private even from across a yard. My first instinct wasn't shock, it was recognition. Something in my chest tightened. Not because I'd uncovered a secret, but because I'd crossed into a space that wasn't meant for me. I should have looked away. I knew that. The knowledge landed fully formed, undeniable. I didn't move. I told myself I wasn't spying, that I wasn't interpreting, that a glance wasn't ownership, that understanding someone didn't require permission. Each justification arrived smoothly, rehearsed, like it had been waiting for its cue. After that, noticing became easier. I noticed when his lights stayed on later, and when they didn't. When his posture changed on the porch, shoulders heavier on certain nights, spine straighter on others. I noticed the days he avoided eye contact entirely, and the days he met it briefly, as if checking a measurement only he understood. I started mapping patterns instead of moments, correlations instead of coincidences. I stopped asking why and started assuming I knew. That's how watching turns into something else, not with urgency, but with repetition, with the quiet confidence that you've earned insight simply by being present. But presence without consent is just proximity, dressed up as care. I caught myself timing my evenings around his routines, pausing a call because I didn't want to miss the sound of his door, standing in darker corners of my yard, not to hide, I told myself, but to avoid being intrusive, as if intention alone could absolve me. The guilt came in waves, sharp enough to register, never strong enough to stop me. Each time I promised it would be the last, each time I stayed a second longer, I wasn't chasing him. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't inserting myself into his life. I wasn't asking for anything. I was just noticing. But noticing had begun to change me, made me tense, made me alert, made me feel responsible for things that weren't mine to hold. I carried his silence like a puzzle, his solitude like a problem I could solve if I just observed closely enough. One night, as I stood watching the light on his porch cut out, I realized I hadn't looked away once. Not when I should have. Not when my instincts warned me. Not when empathy should have turned into respect. I told myself it didn't change how I felt about him, but I stopped looking away. The first time Marwick spoke to me about him, it was framed as concern. That's how control always introduces itself. Soft, reasonable, wrapped in the language of community. He caught me while I was checking the mail, his smile already in place, eyes scanning more than meeting mine. "You've noticed him too," he said, not as a question. Hard not to, right? I didn't answer fast enough. That was my mistake. Marwick Bell ran our HOA the way some people run companies, through documentation, surveillance, and the quiet satisfaction of being obeyed. Cameras perched where they didn't need to be. Emails sent late at night with passive-aggressive phrasing and bolded bylaws. He knew when trash cans stayed out too long. He knew who parked crooked. He knew who didn't belong. Men like that don't end up alone for no reason. He continued lightly. It's better to be proactive. The implication landed before the meaning did. I felt my stomach tighten. Proactive meant reports, logs, patterns written down by someone who decided the story before gathering facts. After that conversation, things shifted. Patrol cars slowed at the end of the block, not stopping, just reminding. Noise complaints appeared in the community portal, vague, anonymous, always timed after his porch light went off. A welfare check, framed as kindness. Another, framed as protocol. Marwick started mentioning concerns casually, like weather updates. Nothing official, he'd say, but I've already flagged a few things with HR equivalent channels, just in case. Just in case was the threat. I realized then how my watching had changed roles. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was evidence, a potential witness. My silence had weight now, and Marwick knew it. He'd positioned himself where my inaction served him better than my honesty ever could. I saw the trap forming and still hesitated, because stepping out of it meant stepping forward, asking questions, naming discomfort, risking attention. Watching had always felt safer than intervening, safer than choosing a side. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about survival. If you've ever realized too late that passivity is still participation, you know the feeling. That hollow drop in your chest when you understand that doing nothing has already cost you something. If this sounds familiar, comment below. Have you ever taken someone for granted? What happened when you realized it? The night everything broke open arrived quietly. 11:17 came and went. No porch light, no familiar silhouette. I waited longer than I should have, tension coiling into something sharp and unpleasant. At 11:43, voices cut through the stillness, raised, accusatory. Marwick's tone, tight with satisfaction. Police lights washed the houses in blue and red, turning windows into mirrors. I stepped outside without thinking. He was on his knees, hands visible, calm in a way that didn't look like resignation, more like preparation. When his eyes found mine, there was no plea there, no accusation either. I told you to sleep, he said evenly, as if we were still standing in our separate yards. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. He didn't resist as they pulled him up, didn't look back when they walked him away. What terrified me wasn't the arrest. It was the certainty in his voice, like this had always been part of the pattern, and I was only just catching up. The days after his arrest stretched thin and brittle, like the air before a storm that never quite breaks. The porch stayed dark. The house felt hollowed out, emptied of whatever gravity had once held my attention in place. I told myself that absence should bring relief, that the tension I'd been living inside would finally loosen now that the pattern was broken. It didn't. Marek moved quickly, too quickly. Notices appeared on doors, community safety updates, carefully worded messages about vigilance, about cooperation, about how grateful everyone should be for systems that worked. People nodded along. They like believing the right mechanisms exist to protect them, even when those mechanisms grind someone else down. I couldn't stop replaying that last sentence he'd said to me. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. It sounded less like a warning and more like an apology, as if he'd known exactly how the story would look from the outside and how hard it would be to step back from it once the narrative settled. I filed a public records request almost by accident, my fingers moving before my courage could catch up. I told myself I just wanted clarity, that information would calm me, that facts would replace speculation. They did the opposite. The documents didn't scream corruption, they whispered it. Small inconsistencies, timelines that bent just enough to avoid snapping, repeated complaints logged by the same source, phrased differently, but always circling the same accusation. Instability, unpredictability, concern for community welfare. Marwick's fingerprints were everywhere, though his name rarely appeared. Buried deeper was a single report that didn't fit the pattern. A witness statement from years ago, a timestamp burned into the page, 11:17 p.m. That was when the truth finally surfaced, not dramatically, not with revelation, but with a quiet sense of shame that settled into my bones. He hadn't been watching the woods. He'd been marking time, standing in the exact minute his younger brother died in a hit and run that was never solved. testifying against the wrong man under pressure, carrying the weight of that mistake alone. The porch wasn't a ritual of menace, it was penance. By the time the charges were dropped, quietly, efficiently, without apology, the damage had already been done. The block returned to its routines. Marwick smiled like someone who'd merely been misunderstood. No one asked what had really happened. No one wanted to know. When the porch light finally came back on, it felt different. Less like a signal, more like an invitation I hadn't earned. He looked toward my yard instead of the trees, eyes steady, expression unreadable. "You weren't wrong to notice," he said the first night we spoke again. "You were wrong not to ask." We didn't fix anything quickly. We didn't pretend it hadn't hurt. We learned slowly that being seen isn't the same as being judged, and that silence left unchecked protects the wrong people. Sometimes I think about how close I came to letting fear define him, how easy it would have been to keep watching instead of choosing empathy. And I wonder how many stories end that way, unresolved, because someone decided observation was enough. My new neighbor did something every night. What shocked me wasn't what he was doing, it was how long I waited to understand it. I'm telling this now because routines are easy to judge from the outside, because quiet makes people nervous, because I learned how quickly curiosity can turn into harm when it isn't paired with courage. Nothing about this story ends cleanly. The neighbor who orchestrated the pressure still lives here. The systems that enabled it never apologized. And the man I watched still carries a loss that doesn't fade just because the truth finally surfaced. What changed was smaller and heavier. I stopped confusing distance with innocence. I stopped treating attention like neutrality. I learned that noticing someone is a responsibility, not a pastime, and that if you're close enough to observe, you're close enough to ask. Some nights, the porch light still comes on, not always at the same minute, not always for long. When it does, I don't hide in the dark anymore. I step outside, breathe the air, let myself be seen too. Not because I'm owed anything, but because choosing empathy means showing up before fear writes the ending for you. If this story stirred something uncomfortable, don't scroll past it. Sit with it and tell me, have you ever watched instead of asking? What did it cost you? Sometimes the most important moment isn't when the pattern begins. It's when you finally decide not to look away.